So you want to get off your medication, but working with your doctor so far hasn't helped you get all the information that you need. This is the place to start. Hopefully I can help you kind of navigate all the complexities of getting off your medication. I'm going to focus specifically on benzodiazepines here because they're the most complex and dangerous medications to taper off of, but the same principles apply to any drug. So keep watching no matter what kind of help you need. Just for reference, the information that I'm going to be providing here today is taken from the experts on the medical board. These are doctors and researchers at the Alliance for Benzodiazepine Best Practices. These are the guys who go around the country and do continuing education courses for other doctors to teach them about this stuff. And of course, a lot of the information that they have is taken from the original researcher, Dr. and Professor Heather Ashton, the fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, who did the bulk of the research initially on benzodiazepine withdrawal. All right, so let's get started. First off, what you're going to want to focus on before you even begin or attempt to begin tapering is to do your own sort of analysis or research into your medical history. So what you're going to want to do is look back at all of the medications that you have been prescribed and have particularly recently started or stopped. A lot of people don't realize how much starting and stopping different meds plays into their taper. When you begin a taper, you want to be as stable as possible. And getting off and on various medications can really throw a kink into your nervous system, and highly sensitizing you to any changes. With benzodiazepines specifically, this is called kindling. But I've seen this happen with other medications. People who get off and get back on, and I've even seen this with myself, you might develop new symptoms, which you don't realize are actually an effect of altering your medication dosage so much. So just be aware of this. This could be any psych meds, it could be steroids, it could be other things that impact GABA, similar to a benzodiazepine, like progesterone. Hormones play a big part in this. Fluoroquinolone antibiotics are going to really affect this because they actually displace benzodiazepines from their receptors and compete for the same enzyme. So if you've taken ciprofloxacin or Levaquin, is that affecting you, or could it potentially affect you when you start to taper? So make sure you kind of have your own history under your belt so you know what's going on and what any potential risks are. The other reason for this is to know what you want to start tapering. You may think that you want to start tapering your benzo first, but then after doing a little bit of research, maybe you might decide you might want to taper your antidepressant first or whatever. Just in my experience, I would just say that normally the medication that you taper first, you can taper a little easier, or it's maybe the process goes a little more quickly because you have this other medication, say the benzo or whatever, to kind of act as a buffer. I know that's how it was for me. I tapered for various reasons my antidepressant first, and that wasn't nearly as difficult because I still had the benzo to kind of stabilize me and help with sleep. But I've seen it the other way around. People taper the benzo first. That's not as hard. Then when they try and get off the antidepressant, it's a much slower process and one with which they have to be much more careful. So keep that in mind and know that if you're wanting to get off of everything, how you responded, how many times you've been off and on a med, and etc., could impact that decision. All right, so after you've figured out what your history with those medications are, if you are on a benzodiazepine and want to get off, also know that alcohol plays a big part in this. If you drink alcohol, you're going to have to stop. You can't be constantly punching those GABA receptors all the time with alcohol, or even occasionally. That's going to really throw a kink in the tapering process. If you are really sensitive to benzodiazepines, if you're having a really hard time and you need to get off, and also you're drinking alcohol, or you have a problem with alcohol consumption, just know that a typical sort of detox program may not be the best option for you. Even if you are kind of dealing with an addiction, I have seen people successfully taper their alcohol actually in this process because sudden withdrawal like that wasn't a great option for them. So keep that in mind as well. And then finally, the other reason why you want to just have a real awareness of your medical history and the medications that you're taking is because you might be taking multiple benzodiazepines. And in fact, you might be taking multiple benzos and not even know it. I've actually seen this a lot. So let's say you're taking Klonopin during the day for anxiety, and then you're taking what is actually referred to as a benzodiazepine receptor agonist, such as Lunesta or Ambien at night for sleep. So when you begin the tapering process, and we'll go into this a little bit more later, it can really destabilize you to be trying to like carefully taper this benzo throughout the day, and then just getting that punch to your GABA receptors at night, or your benzodiazepine receptors of that Ambien or that Lunesta that has a super short half-life. So you get like this punch and then this drop, and then you're going through this taper and you can't figure out why you can't stabilize. Well, that would be why. So in that case, what you would want to do then is discuss with your provider if they would be willing to switch you over to an equivalent amount of a longer acting benzodiazepine. So find, and I'm going to provide a link down below so you can know what those equivalencies are and figure that out. But figure out what the equivalent amount of that Ambien or Lunesta would be to the Klonopin that you're on, and then just up your Klonopin dose. And then we'll discuss a little bit later on the mechanics of how you'd go about dosing that throughout the day. All right, so once you've figured out your kind of medical history and how that's going to impact your taper, the next thing you're going to want to focus on is getting stable. So as I mentioned, all these things can kind of impact you, and if you've recently been off and on some things, you may want to consider just waiting. Sometimes it takes a long time for you to stabilize after making medication changes, and you don't realize how much they're impacting you because the symptoms can be so weird and seem unrelated, but they really all can be from particularly benzodiazepine and psych med switches. So be aware of that. If you have recently tried to rapidly taper your benzodiazepine and you're on a lower dose and you're just really not doing well, you might want to consider going back up to your original dose and seeing if that helps you to stabilize. Or if you've like cold turkeyed and gotten back on, even your original dose may not be enough to help you stabilize. And this is a tricky place to be because, I'm not a doctor and I don't want to like be telling people to updose because that can come with its own problems. But ultimately, the most important thing at the beginning of a taper is to try to get as stable as possible. So that might be something you want to consider and discuss with your doctor if that's a good option for you, not to updose or at least to get back on your original dose and get stable before you start tapering. Because if you are stable, your taper is going to go a lot smoother. It might even not take as long. So you really do want to start from the best place possible. So the other thing in getting stable also is that you might want to find a good functional medicine doctor, an ND. These are doctors who can prescribe, but they also know how to address things without complicating your taper by adding in other medications for problems maybe with hormone regulation or with your gut. If your gut biome is off, particularly from lots of antibiotics, that can actually really impact your taper. And they can just help to stabilize various parts of various systems in your body in ways that could really help you to have a good place to start from before you begin your taper. So after you've kind of got that under your belt, the next thing we're going to move on to is what form of medication do you want to use to taper? And this is going to really play into a lot of things down the road. So if you're currently taking a tablet and you think that, you can handle this and your brain can handle some math, then you might just want to consider doing the dry cut method. I have a video that you can watch in my tapering playlist. Please go to that to learn some more about dry cutting, but you can use this for making big cuts, or you can even use it for the micro tapering process. It works either way. It does require a little calculation on your part and some equipment, and I have links to all that in the video. Another option, if you want to micro taper and do a slower taper, a more careful taper, is you can go to your provider and ask her to prescribe you some kind of a liquid solution, a liquid version of that medication that is actually made by the pharmaceutical company. This may not be an option for everyone for various reasons, partly because maybe your medication isn't available in liquid version, or because you're so sensitive that switching from whatever pill you're currently taking to the liquid version, they use different powders of the medication to create those solutions. And people who are highly sensitive, even if there's like a change in brand between, say, like one brand of Valium and another, can really be painful or throw them off. So, I mean, you're always welcome to try the liquid version and see if you're stable on that or not. And then if you're not, try some of these other options. So if for whatever reason that isn't available to you, the next thing that you could do is go to your provider and get a liquid compound. So it's kind of a similar idea. The pharmacist would order in a powdered version of whatever you're taking, and they would create basically a suspension in some kind of a fatty substance. I will say in my experience that suspensions seem to have a lot of problems. People don't react well to them, and I don't know if it's because they're not as accurate, or again, it's like a different version, so they're not responding well to that. But some people, it's almost like they're doing micro tapers, but then it's almost like they're making huge cuts, even though they're not making big cuts. So just be aware of that may not work for you, or it's cost prohibitive because it can also be kind of expensive. So that brings us to the version that I used, which was the water titration method, or creating your own water suspension. I have a video on that, again, in my playlist, so please look at that. It's actually just like taking your pill. So you're sticking with the same pill, except you're just drinking it with a lot of water. And there are different variations on that you can find in support groups, but the way I show is the simplest. So once you've kind of figured out what form of medication works for you, and you actually may want to consider some of the things we're going to talk about now before you decide on that, you're going to want to figure out how many times a day you need to dose. If you're severely tolerant, or you're experiencing what are known as interdose withdrawals, you may need to change up how many times a day you dose. That doesn't mean you're changing the actual dose that you're taking. It means you're breaking that up into multiple doses, smaller doses, and dosing more frequently throughout the day. So again, if you're somebody who is taking Ambien at night and Klonopin during the day, and you converted over the Ambien to Klonopin, then this is going to be really useful for you, because you're going to want to break up those doses, right? So that you're taking some at night, some during the day. And this is going to be easiest to do with some form of, usually a liquid version, or the micro tapering dry cut method that I mentioned. But that, that's a lot more work. So, I mean, that's up to you. Some people have to do the dry cut method, actually, because their medications just don't respond well even in water. So, something to consider. But depending on which medication you're on, that's going to determine how many times a day that you might need to dose. And also, it just depends on your sensitivity. I could personally tell when I was tapering, when I first started rapidly tapering Ativan, I could literally feel these drops every couple of hours. Like I could time it almost by the hour when that was going to happen. See, that is related to the half-life. That's the metabolites in that drug breaking down in that first couple of hours. And then it breaks down into like a different metabolite in the next set and the next. And by the time I would get to the evening when I would normally take my dose of Ativan, my whole dose, I would just be dying. I mean, it would just be so painful. I would just be gritting my teeth waiting to take that dose. And then when I would get some relief. So if you're experiencing anything like that, definitely you're going to want to consider breaking up your doses. And then also, even if you're like not already experiencing that, that doesn't mean that you might not be sensitive enough that later on, as you get lower in your dose, that you might not experiencing this. So some people might be at like 10 milligrams of Valium, so they're not really feeling it. But then you get down to 5 milligrams and all of a sudden you are feeling those metabolites breaking down. And now you're wishing that you had sort of spread your doses out more. You certainly can always switch stuff up in the middle of your taper, but it's really hard, and it's better to do that at the beginning when you're more stable. So just for reference, and this is really taken from the wisdom of the tens of thousands of people in online support communities who've done this for decades. Generally, what people find is that if you're on Klonopin, which tends to have a bit of a longer half-life, you may want to break your dose up into 3 to 4 doses a day. If you're on Ativan, it has a pretty short half-life, so maybe you're going to want to go from 4 to 5 doses a day. And again, this isn't set in stone. Do what works for you, but as a general reference, this is true. Xanax has a very, very short half-life, so you're gonna maybe dose 6 to 8 times a day. That may even include getting up in the middle of the night and doing some of these doses. Also, Xanax or any medication that comes in an extended release, you're still going to need to dose multiple times a day, but that doesn't work with an extended release tablet or pill. So in this case, you may want to go to your doctor and ask him to prescribe you the regular version of that medication. So cross over to the regular version and then break that up into multiple doses and do it that way. And then Valium, even Valium, which has technically a really long half-life, it still starts breaking down into different metabolites throughout the day, and you may be very sensitive to that. And so some people will dose their Valium as much as 2 to 3 times a day. All right, but you're still starting off with the same amount. You're just breaking that up into smaller amounts. With any of these things that I've mentioned so far, it's important to make sure that you don't begin tapering at all. Like you don't start reducing at all until you've got all of this stuff under your belt. So if you're switching over, let's say, to a liquid compound, make sure that you've crossed over to that. Make sure that you're stable on it, that yes, this is going to work for me before you begin to reduce at all. Same thing with breaking up your dose into multiple doses. Do that first. Get used to whatever form of the medication you're taking. Give it at least a week or 2 and then start your taper. And things should hopefully go more smoothly for you. Just another note on switching over to like a longer acting benzodiazepine. I know that's generally what's recommended. A lot of this comes from the Ashton manual because Valium is a much longer acting benzodiazepine, and also Valium comes in larger doses. In other words, these newer benzodiazepines, they sound like they're small doses, but they're actually really big doses compared to Valium. And so it makes them much harder to taper. So for instance, if you have a little teeny Ativan pill that's 2 milligrams, well, that's going to be equivalent to 20 milligrams of Valium. So there's a lot more pill there that you can work with in creating a suspension or cutting or whatever you need to do. So it can make it easier in that way. And of course, it has the longer half-life, so you're not experiencing interdose withdrawals. But that doesn't mean that switching over to a longer acting benzo is always your best option. Again, because being highly sensitive, you never know how you're going to respond to a new medication. That's why Ashton recommends a crossover where for a period of 4 weeks, maybe you take out a quarter of your dose. So if I were on 2 milligrams, of Ativan, I would take out half a milligram of Ativan, and I would replace that with the equivalent amount of Valium, which would be 5 milligrams of Valium in that first week. And the reason why you do that is to see, first of all, how you respond to the medication and see if that's really the dose you need. The link that I'm going to be providing here is going to give you sort of a range. I'll provide both. I'll provide Atkins and the one from the Benzo Reform, or the Alliance for Benzodiazepine Best Practices, but there's kind of a range, and so some people may need less, some might need more. So that's why a crossover works that way, is to kind of help you determine what the right dose is, so you're not kind of over medicating yourself or over sedating yourself or whatever. I will say that had I known beforehand that micro tapering, that liquid titration was an option that I could use to break up my dose and do it multiple times throughout the day, I don't think I would have switched to Valium personally, just because it was a lot harder on my liver, because it is coursing through you constantly like that. And it did sort of make me more depressed and things like that. So just know that you have options. Okay, there's the longer acting benzos and there are the shorter ones, and you can work with both. And oftentimes, unfortunately, doctors don't love to prescribe Valium, which I find hilarious, because they think of that as the bad benzo, which is like, yeah, they're all benzos. So any benzo can be abused. It's not about, addiction when it comes to a careful taper, but they're reticent. So, keep that in mind as well. And that actually brings me to the next point, which is communicating with your doctor. Now, obviously, if you need help in switching your prescription around or whatever, you're gonna want to communicate with your doctor. But that can kind of be treacherous territory in this day and age, where doctors are getting in trouble for overprescribing controlled substances, or where they just don't have a knowledge and an understanding of benzodiazepine syndrome and why it would be so difficult for somebody to get off. So then their mind automatically goes to addiction, and then they just cut you off. If this is the case, if you feel that this is could be the case, I guess, with your doctor, then I would just urge you to maybe take a few extra steps before letting them know that you're about to taper. So first of all, follow the link that I'm going to provide to Benzo Reform. There's a communication pamphlet that you can download and actually take to your doctor, and it's going to have a little QR code on there that you can scan that will take them to all the information that they will need, so they can kind of get educated and have a little bit more understanding and be a little bit less suspicious and more willing to work with you. And it'll give you kind of a dialogue that you can practice in introducing the pamphlet in the first place, because it can be really tricky and you don't want to offend your doctor, because they're the person that you need to help you prescribe this. At the same time, if you really just are leery, or your doctor doesn't seem willing to work with you, or you're worried you're going to get cut off, I would say plan this all out ahead of time. Do what you're going to do. Have it even just written out, like, this is my start date, this is my estimated end date. It's not set in stone, but I have a plan. I've got this. The plan is to get off. Maybe you could kind of help ease their anxiety about this a little bit, and make this process easier on you. So yeah, just consider, do I want to tell my doctor right away, or is this going to be a bigger risk for me in the long run? And finally, I just want you guys to understand, these are all just kind of guidelines. Nothing here is set in stone. Whatever you start off with, you might need to change that. But ultimately, this is all just sort of information to help you determine, am I going to be super sensitive? Am I going to be one of those people who needs to do a really, really slow taper, a micro taper? Or am I young? Have I only been on this a really short period of time? I've never been on a benzo before, so I haven't kindled, and I just want to get off this fast. If that's you, you might just be able to make a cut 1/8 of your pill. It's not going to be accurate. It's not exactly 1/8 of the dose, but if you're not sensitive, that's really not going to affect you that much. Cut a little bit off, wait a week or two. If you're doing great, continue on. If you hit a hiccup in this process, then come back here, review some more information, watch my videos on the other methods of tapering, and implement something that will help you get stable and finish getting off the rest of your benzodiazepine. It's all doable. Everyone's different. Just know that it, even if it's a painful process, it is worth it ultimately. And look, I'm not here to tell anybody you have to get off your benzo or you should get off your benzo, but I have seen enough over the years to know that just because it's an option to take your benzodiazepine right now because your prescriber is willing to give it to you, that doesn't mean that's always going to be the case. I mean, just look at what happened during the pandemic. I mean, people were not having access to their medications for a little while. That was a scary place to be. It's possible these things could happen again, or your prescriber just all of a sudden gets nervous and decides to start cutting people off. Whatever the reason, it's so much better to start from a place where you're in control, where you're stable, you know what you're doing, and you get to determine the rate at which you taper and all of that, rather than coming from a place where you're being forced, where you're fearful, where your body's overwhelmed because you're getting off so rapidly. So I would just say, if you're thinking about it at all, if you're considering it and you haven't made up your mind, there's no time like the present. But take your time, make a plan, get everything that you need in place, and please watch the other videos on my tapering playlist before starting, especially the Ashton manual. There's going to be a lot of other information there that I just can't go over here because, it would just take so much longer. But all right, so those are the basics of tapering. That's what you need to know. I hope that this kind of gives you a little bit of confidence to continue to pursue this and learn a little bit more and finally fulfill your goal of being drug-free.